I'm reading an article about state-based versus signal-based rendering, and let's just read the first paragraph and try to understand what's going on, okay? State-based versus signal-based rendering. When we think about state management in front-end frameworks, we often focus on the API, hooks, observables, or signals. However, there's a deeper paradigm shift at play, where rendering happens. Traditional state management like React hooks triggers renders at the point where state is created. So let me say that again. Traditional state management renders at the point, traditional state management triggers renders at the point where state is created. Okay, so traditional state management triggers renders at the point where state is created, while signal-based approaches like Preact Signals or Solid.js trigger renders only where state is consumed. So signal-based approaches trigger renders only where state is consumed. Once again, traditional state management triggers renders at the point where state is created. Okay, triggers renders at the point where state is created versus trigger renders only where state is consumed. This shift from render where you create state to render where you use state has profound implication for performance, code organization, and mental models. So because the first paragraph is so important, I'll read it again. When we think about state management in front-end frameworks, we often focus on the API, hooks, observables, or signals. However, there's a deeper paradigm shift at play where rendering happens. Okay, so there are two places where rendering can happen. One, rendering happens at the point where state is created. Okay, rendering happens at the point where state is created versus rendering happens where state is consumed. So if state is created and never consumed, that's the implied thing here, that you should not trigger render if state is created but never consumed, right? But why would you create state if you never want to consume it? That will probably come later in the article, but for now, the thing to remember is there are two places where rendering can happen. One is where state is created, and two, where state is consumed. This shift from render where you create state to render where you use state has profound implications for performance, code organization, and mental models. The core difference: in traditional state management with React hooks, when you call useState, any update that the state causes the component and all its descendants to re-render. Actually, I remember when this was still revolutionary, so calling it traditional is kind of strange. In traditional state management with React hooks, when you call useState, any update to that state causes the component and all its descendants to re-render. It doesn't matter whether those descendants actually use the state. They are caught in the render wave simply because they're children of the component that holds that state. With signal-based rendering, the paradigm inverts. A signal is a reactive primitive that tracks its own dependencies. When you create a signal, it doesn't trigger re-renders at the creation site. Instead, rendering only occurs at components that actually access the signal's value. This granular reactivity means only the precise components that depend on the signal will re-render when it updates. The mental model shift from prevent unnecessary read and re-renders to re-render only happens when they are needed.